This time, on Only in America, a flavor of Texas, how NAFTA has boosted the Lone Star economy.
If you go back to 1992, the city of Laredo's unemployment rate was 13%. Today it's about 4.5%. You look at Dallas and Houston, their unemployment rate in 92 was in the 8 to 9% range, and today it's half of that. So NAFTA changed the face of Texas.
How to avoid the looming labor shortages in the great state.
This exodus of the baby boomers, and with economic growth really in the balance, the only way to grow is to grow through immigration and the contributions of immigrants and the children of immigrants. So the less immigration there is, the slower we will grow.
And how the communities of Houston rebounded from a natural disaster.
It was the worst flooding event in recorded history, and you saw people come together. U.S.-born citizens, white, black, immigrants, undocumented immigrants. Everybody came together.
I'm Ali Noorani, and this is Only in America. There are a series of deadlines between next month and next summer, which will shape the lives of roughly 320,000 people from 9 countries who have temporary protected status, commonly known as TPS. The law protects immigrants who are unable to return safely to their home country because of armed conflict, an environmental disaster, or other issues. People from El Salvador, Honduras, and Haiti form the biggest numbers of TPS recipients. Earlier this year, researchers at the University of Kansas found that TPS recipients have very high levels of participation in the labor force. The Center for Migration Studies found people from the top 3 countries work mostly in construction and the food service sector, and almost a third of them, 61,000, have mortgages. I was in Houston last week chatting with the leadership of the Houston Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. While the business leaders in the room were certainly focused on protecting DACA recipients, an undercurrent of the conversation was the region's sizable TPS workforce from El Salvador. The question they asked, how does Houston rebuild if a large portion of its construction workforce is removed? Whether it is a legislative solution or a renewal, TPS will not remain below the surface for long. Meanwhile, on the DACA front, in the Senate, Tillis, Lankford, Graham, Durbin are all part of active conversations on how to proceed. The House is what worries me. The working group is, working. To what end is really anyone's guess. Chairman Goodlatte can't even get a mediocre agricultural bill out of committee. And meanwhile, House leadership are keeping their powder dry. A lot needs to happen in the next couple of months to bring a resolution by year end. Not impossible by any means, but the wheels feel a little bit stuck. If Congress doesn't get to a solution on DACA by year end, the first quarter of 2018 will get pretty complicated for Republicans. From the far right, primary challengers recruited by Steve Bannon will drive an immigration wedge through the electorate. Meanwhile, Dreamers, progressives, and their liberal allies will increase the intensity of their pressure. And from the center right, conservative and moderate faith law enforcement business leaders will urge Republicans to move forward. In all this, how President Trump reacts will be quite crucial. Will he side with Bannon and company, snatching defeat on DACA from the jaws of victory? Or, as I wrote on FoxNews.com last week, will Trump have his, quote, Nixon goes to China moment and lead the country to an immigration solution accomplishing something that eluded both Obama and Bush? Curious times. I'm Ali Noorani. Hurricane Harvey devastated towns and cities in the great state of Texas, and more than 75 people died, most from the overwhelming floods. The storm brought enormous challenges to the city of Houston, but its police chief, Art Acevedo, found a silver lining in the aftermath.
We saw what happens when you have the most diverse city in this nation, Houston, Texas, the most diverse city in the country, where we work collectively to make everyone feel welcomed. And we saw during Hurricane Harvey, where it was the worst flooding event in recorded history. And you saw people come together. U.S.-born citizens, white, black, immigrants, undocumented immigrants. Everybody came together to work with one another. And I think that what you saw demonstrated there I really believe the city of Houston is it's really a snapshot of what this country is going to look like 15, 20 years from now. We can't stop it. It is what it is. The birth rate is really on the declining worldwide. And the truth of the matter is, we have to be very careful we are to remain a world power, because as the birth rate continues to go down, the pressure on societies around this world and for governments to continue to expand and to grow economically and sustain society is going to be critical to have immigrants. And if we continue with this mean-spirited political debate here, people have options. They have other nations. They have Australia, New Zealand, all over the civilized world. We're going to be competing for immigrants. So I think we're a nation built by immigrants, sustained by immigrants, and it will continue to be sustained by immigrants into the future. And so I'm hoping that what we're doing here is painting a factual picture of what immigrants need to be felt welcome and what the value is for all Americans when we act in that manner.
Chief Acevedo was speaking at our recent convening in Washington, D.C., Leading the Way, a new approach to American immigration. The convening brought together experts and opinion makers on immigration from across the United States. You can find out more about Leading the Way at our website, immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, check out our podcast page. Coming up, more from Texas and frustration with national lawmakers.
As Congress continues to focus on the punitive part of border enforcement, what they're missing is the fact that we're running out of people in this country.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding, and from the Walmart Foundation, so retail sector employees can receive contextualized English language training through our project, Skills and Opportunity for the New American Workforce.
The White House has thrown into doubt the future of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is up for renewal soon. You need a sense of history to understand NAFTA's roots. It was signed by President George H.W. Bush, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and Canada's Prime Minister Brian Mulroney back in 1992 to compete for trade with the European Union and other international alliances. Its success can best be demonstrated in Texas. On my recent travels to the Lone Star State, I've met up with Eddie Aldretti, a third-generation American, a proud Texan, and senior vice president of the International Bank of Commerce. Eddie is also the vice chair of our board of directors at the forum.
You know, there's an old saying that you can tell a Texan's bragging when their lips are moving. In the last few years, we're quite proud of what we call the Texas Miracle, and that's the growth and prosperity of the state with all the companies that have located and relocated here. But if you go back to 1992, the city of Laredo's unemployment rate was 13%. Today, it's about 4.5%. So you look at Dallas and Houston, their unemployment rate in 92 was in the 8 to 9% range, and today it's half of that. So NAFTA changed the face of Texas, and it allowed the U.S. and Mexico and Canada to come together and form an economic union to compete primarily with Europe and with Asia. But because of our geographic proximity to Mexico, most of our NAFTA work is with Mexico.
What I find amazing when you look at the map of the United States is I-35. It starts in Brownsville, runs right up through the gut of the country up to Wisconsin. And it is, even to somebody who doesn't know the details of trade, it is the kind of the silk highway of trade between U.S., Mexico, and Canada. As you're trying to make the case for the Texas economy in the context of trade, how does that I-35 highway, how does that play into it?
Well, to just clarify, I-35 starts in Laredo and goes up into Minnesota and hits the Canadian border. It's often called the NAFTA Highway. It was the first major north-south corridor connecting the three countries. And since then, other corridors have opened up. But it's also part of the explanation of the growth of IBC Bank, because we were headquartered in Laredo. We grew into San Antonio, Austin, and we skipped over Dallas into the Oklahoma area, and then now we're backfilling in the Dallas market. So it is, and if you just follow I-35, you'll see the growth in the trucking companies and the warehousing companies. You look at the fact that the largest brewery in the world is right on the other side of the Rio Grande from Eagle Pass, Texas. They have 100 railroad boxcars of beer that enter the United States every day, and 100% of what they produce is for the American market. There are a lot of those stories. You look at the only Toyota Tundra plant in the U.S. is in San Antonio. Their Tier 1 suppliers are in San Antonio, but their Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers are in Mexico. And what most people forget about, most foreign products that are imported in the United States, especially under the NAFTA umbrella, have major U.S. content. So about 40% of the Tundra is made in the United States, and then it's put together and assembled here in the United States.
So talk a little bit about San Antonio and that Toyota plant, because I think it's a great example of a company investing in a changing economy that's obviously geographically well located, but also the investment they have made in the San Antonio workforce.
Yeah, so Toyota looked at other states, and they were looking at Texas, and two things struck them. I guess three. Number one was the workforce that we have available in San Antonio and in Texas. Number two was their geographic proximity to Mexico and the Mexican suppliers. And number three was the amount of trucks that are purchased in the state of Texas. So they looked at those three things. But ironically, they've been open for 12 years, and they've never really been at full employment. And it's one of the challenges that we have in this country, because as a country, we're having fewer children, and we have some geographic disparities. We have people who are unemployed that might live in Detroit, but the job opportunity might be in Texas. And so if you've born and raised in Detroit and you don't want to leave your family, it's a little bit of a workforce challenge that we have today in this country.
And that's where I feel like the trade question starts to connect to the immigration question. And you know, when we look ahead to even the year 2020, which is pretty much around the corner, we see that there's going to be a 7.5 million private sector worker shortage, particularly in the middle skills portion of the economy. So when you look at the question of workforce, skills gaps, trade, you know, in a state like Texas, you know, number one, what's the immigration challenge, and then what's the immigration solution?
Texas used to brag about its workforce, but here's the challenge. Reality is catching up to our image of being this economic development miracle. The reality is what you mentioned. We are seeing workforce shortages across the board in a variety of industries, low-skilled, medium-skilled, high-skilled areas. And as a country, you either create your own human capital or you import the human capital. And right now, we're not doing either. We're not having enough children to replace ourselves as a population. Neither do we have an immigration system that works in order to bring in the people that we need to keep our economy growing.
You know, as you've been thinking about the renegotiation of NAFTA, you know, what are the solutions that you've been advocating for with your colleagues in Texas?
Well, ironically, the one piece of NAFTA that never got negotiated, we provided for the movement of goods and services, but we never really provided for the movement of labor. And if you look across the globe, most countries are either in population decline or they are leveling off, and decline is around the corner. And no country, no business is founded upon an economic prospect of stagnation or decline. They're all focused on growth. But you can't grow without a workforce. An engine can't move without gas in the tank. And so this is the key challenge, and we're frustrated with, as Congress continues to focus on the punitive part of border enforcement, what they're missing is the fact that we're running out of people in this country. And that's what we hope that they will begin to look at. It's not a gift to anyone. It's not a freebie. We should be looking at immigration reform to be able to satisfy the needs of this country, to keep our businesses working and growing, and to keep the economy working and growing.
So having grown up, in South Texas and now working there so much, you have also a really unique perspective on border enforcement and border security. What do you think Congress should be doing in terms of protecting the southwest border?
We have a very unique situation in Texas in that we're the only state that has a river as our international boundary. And we believe that we should be working with the river and with our natural amenities like the Big Bend National Park. President Trump has already said there's parts of the border like the Big Bend where it just doesn't work to put a fence or a wall. But the reality is that the number one issue that Border Patrol wants is a line of sight. And we have two major invasive species in Texas that grow along the river, the Rio Grande. One is Carrizo cane and one is salt cedar. They both pollute the river. They both suck up large amounts of water from the river, and everybody wants them gone. Environmentalists want those two plants gone. Farmers, ranchers, landowners, municipalities. The only disagreement you get is how you eradicate them. But by eradicating them, you then give the Border Patrol the access to the water line they want, and you give them the line of visibility. And by removing those plants, anyone who crosses the river, now they're more vulnerable because they're in an open space. We've actually spoken to the Mexican business community who's relayed this concept to President Peña Nieto, and the message that he relayed back to us was if the U.S. cleans up their side of the river, Mexico will clean up theirs. And what we believe is then fewer people are likely to cross the river.
It almost seems to make too much sense.
It does.
So, what do you think that the next year looks like when you look at these issues of border enforcement, immigration reform, trade? How does this all play out?
Right now, we're in the middle of the NAFTA negotiations. I think everyone's goal, we've heard Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and we've heard U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer both express a desire in a perfect world to wrap up by the end of the year, because if we go into January, we then begin to interfere and step on the U.S. elections as well as the Mexican presidential election, and that's not good for either one of the countries and for the NAFTA negotiations. So I do think with the DACA and the Dreamer issue, Congress now has a deadline, and they seem to work better when they have a pending deadline. So I think, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get some resolution there. I think there's going to be some border security components, but I hope they limit it to border enforcement so that we can achieve two things at once, both the border enforcement as well as solving the DACA and Dreamer issue.
And does border enforcement, does it need a wall or no?
Well, in Texas, I don't think so, because we should be using the geographic boundary to our benefit. And I think if you clean up the river and you provide Border Patrol access to the water line, whether that's building river roads, again, that's something that is unanimously supported by all the interested parties along the Rio Grande. So I don't think we need a wall. Maybe in certain strategic places out in the middle of nowhere, but not in the highly populated municipalities and along the southern part of the state.
And then final question, if I'm a tourist to Texas, what are the three places I absolutely must visit?
Well, Austin is a very unique city. Austin has a lot of lakes and a lot of, in the hill country right outside of Austin, a lot of people hiking, biking. I would compare Austin to Portland, great climate, a lot of outdoor activities. And I think I would say San Antonio next because of great food, great opportunities, especially along the Riverwalk and all the missions in Texas. And the third one, I would say the Palo Duro Canyon. If you've never seen it, it's in the Panhandle of Texas. They actually shot the last scene of one of the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie because it looks identical to the Grand Canyon, just on a smaller scale.
That is the first time I think anybody has said that Texas is on a smaller scale, but we can strike that. Eddie, thank you very, very much for the opportunity to talk. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Eddie Aldretti is the Vice Chair of the Board at the National Immigration Forum and Senior Vice President of the International Bank of Commerce, now based in San Antonio. I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America. Back to Austin and the annual Texas Tribune Festival, which brings together experts to talk about 21st century America. There I met Pia Arrhenius, senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and she told me about her concerns for the state's economic future. So I'm with Pia at the Texas Tribune Festival in Austin, correct? So there are a lot of people with long beards walking around and skinny jeans. Or not. But in any case, what we wanted to talk to you about today was two things. The big picture on immigrants and the workforce, the nation's workforce, but then also talk a little bit more about how the trade debate is playing out. With the renegotiation of NAFTA coming up, and politically how these things are conflated, I think, in the public's minds. But in this conversation, really trying to unpack the two questions around immigration, the importance of immigration to the nation's workforce, but also then trade and the importance of trade to the American economy. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, so let's start with immigration and the and how, from your perspective, as you looked at the data, how the nation's economy is changing and why we as a country need a functioning immigration system.
Fascinating when you look back and you look at the influence that immigration has had on economic growth, but it's even more astounding really to look forward and see the challenges that are coming up demographically and how immigration can help us meet those challenges. So let me describe what I mean. If we look back over the past 2 decades, we'll see that if you do the math about immigrants have been almost half of labor force growth over the last 2 decades. Looking forward, immigrants and their children are going to be all of labor force growth, so over the next 20 years. Why is that? It's because the baby boomers are retiring. So if you divide up the labor force into immigrants, their children, and everybody else, basically natives who, U.S.-born individuals with U.S.-born parents, are going to be declining in net number by 8 million over the next 20 years. With this exodus of the baby boomers and, with economic growth, in the balance, the only way to grow is to grow through immigration and the contributions of immigrants and the children of immigrants. So the less immigration there is, the slower we will grow.
And do you feel like this exodus is playing out in any particular industries of note, either regionally or nationally?
Some regions of the country are definitely aging faster than others. It's not necessarily correlated with immigration yet, but I imagine it will be. Basically, immigration has been very highly correlated with growth, which means it's been concentrated in the last 20 years in the Mountain West and the Southwest and the Southeast. Whereas the U.S. population aging the fastest, probably in the Midwest and the Northeast. But really, as these things, because there's free movement between the states, what we've seen is that really as growth has shifted, we've seen immigrant populations shift with it. So immigrants are very good at moving to where the jobs are. And that's actually been an additional benefit of immigration.
That's interesting because, we're always kind of challenged with this question of, in the Midwest, the high unemployment rates, but then you have these parts of the Southwest and parts of Texas that have very tight labor markets. Are you saying that the mobility of the native-born, the American worker is just not the same as folks who've just come?
Right. The recent immigrants are actually the most mobile, and so they do tend to move to where the economy is growing, and we really need that to happen. In fact, we need everybody to move out, to respond to economic signals and market forces and move out of declining areas to growing areas. But of course, it's difficult, and if you're settled, as most U.S. families are settled in their areas and they don't want to leave, and it's difficult to leave, and it's expensive to get up and move. Immigrants, of course, coming with very little, especially when they're recent immigrants, it's much easier for them to move, and they do. But certainly that's an issue, and there's been a lot of studies done on the declining mobility in the U.S. population. But I bring it up just because it's one other area where we're seeing that immigrants are contributing disproportionately. Of course, I will say, though, that now that we've had less immigration, especially since the Great Recession, that we're also beginning to see the immigrant population age, and as they age, they will too become less mobile. So unless you're refreshing the workforce with new immigration, you're not going to have that mobility either. The key is, of course, for there to be economic growth. That's what would motivate the additional immigration, but that's really the engine that makes this car run.
And then how do you discuss or talk about or describe the balance between the need for immigration and the need for the American worker to thrive? Because a lot of people will see those as very different, two different answers.
Well, you're right to say it is a balance because and a well-designed policy, I think, can definitely strike the right balance. It's not right to say that there's no adverse wage and employment effects of immigration on U.S. workers. There's definitely work that shows that for certain subgroups of U.S. workers, there have been negative effects of immigration. But changes, when a lot of policy changes, whether it's immigration, trade, or any other really change, in the economy, there's usually winners and losers. There's usually never something which is what we call in economics a free lunch. Economists love to say there's no free lunch. Well, immigration's not a free lunch either. So what you have to do is take those concerns into consideration, and you have to figure out a policy that works to minimize the adverse effects on U.S. workers or subgroups of U.S. workers, and to direct the flow of immigrant workers into the industries and into the regions that are growing where there's a relative need. So that's really what you have to, you could even go another step further. We actually have a plan where I have a book with my co-author, Madeline Zavodny, where we describe a system where we would actually tax employers who want to hire foreign workers, and then we'd take those revenues and redistribute those. And that would sort of be our way to make sure employers get the workers, but then make sure there's some revenue to redistribute, especially for training and workforce development among workers that may be adversely impacted.
When you redistribute those dollars, is it based on the region that the immigrant comes to, or would it be going to the federal government so that, training programs where they're needed, and, let's say the Texas versus Michigan?
You can set it up any way that you want, but certainly we think it should be a federal program. And so what we've written about is this auction system where employers that want to hire foreign workers have to buy a permit in an auction. And they buy the permit, and the auction proceeds go to the federal government that then redistributes those dollars as they deem fit, or the best way really to offset costs to impacted workers. But under a well-run system, when the economy is growing and labor markets are tight like they are now, there really shouldn't be many adverse impacts on U.S. workers. Because what happens is right now, for example, the unemployment rate is very low, and there's a lot of business investment. This business investment offsets the wage impact of immigration, because when there's business investments shifting out labor demand. So you really have growth, and when you bring in the immigrants, it's really just catching up with growth. So there should not be large or widespread adverse wage effects on U.S. workers. There really shouldn't be. But you do have to be careful, because what we see is actually the workers that are most affected by immigration are the previous immigrants. And it makes sense if you think about it, because they're the most substitutable, we call it in economics, but also the most similar to the new workers are the old workers that also came, say, from Mexico or Central America. And so it's important to safeguard the process of assimilation also, that you're not, that you manage these programs in a good way. There shouldn't be sudden increases or sudden decreases. It should be a well-managed program that, does what it's designed to do.
And then whether it's in your book or your research or your other work, have you looked at a point-based or a merit-based system, such as what's been proposed over the summer by Senators Cotton and Perdue, where they would like to, in essence, transition the entire system to points?
I was surprised to see that proposal, because as we discussed in what we've written on immigration reform, is that these point-based systems have been largely discredited in many ways in the countries that are using them, like Australia and Canada. They're actually been moving away from point systems. And it makes a lot of sense, because the problem with the point system is the government is trying to come up with the value of a certain characteristic, whether it's age or education or occupation. And the government tries to put a number on that, and then they try to, dole out visas based on the numbers. When you add them all up, oh, this is a very valuable immigrant because he has a, lot of education, or he's in this occupation, or it's a young person versus an old person. But of course, invariably, the best way to actually pick these immigrants for the labor market is not based on some resume, but it's based on an employer that wants to hire that worker. That is the absolute best gauge of demand for that individual. And I think if somebody wants to give that person a job, then that person probably deserves a visa or should be eligible for a visa. If the government gives that person enough points, well, the government's not the one who has to hire him. So, the point systems really don't work that well. And I think that's what Canada found out, which is why they moved away from that. Or basically what they did is they gave the most points to the people who had a job offer. And that is really the key role of the employer, is that, first of all, it takes a lot of the onus off of the government. You don't have to struggle with it. It makes it easier. You're pushing the work onto the employer. Hey, you figure out who you want to hire, and then we'll look at that person. If that person passes background screenings and so forth, he gets the visa or she gets the visa.
Can we switch tracks a little bit here and talk about NAFTA? And, I think the country is, clearly the economy is changing domestically, globally. There are a lot of questions about what do trade agreements mean, what don't they mean? And also there's an element of what they mean by region. I think there's a case can be made where NAFTA means a lot of great things for place like Texas, but it also presents a lot of challenges to the Midwest.
Texas has really prospered under NAFTA. In fact, it's under the NAFTA era that Texas became the top trading state in the nation. So no state in the U.S. exports more than Texas, and we're first by far. And this transition happened under NAFTA, and I think it's not all due to it, of course, but it's been a significant impetus. And I think that there's been some relocation of auto manufacturers into the state because of proximity to Mexico and because of the success of NAFTA, especially in certain industries such as automotive, other industries, computers and electronics, televisions, that type of thing. So really the spillovers are evident on Texas. Laredo is one of the most important land ports in the nation. Houston, I think, is the third largest seaport in the nation. So Texas has really benefited from globalization, and Texas hasn't suffered as much with globalization as perhaps the Midwest, as the point that you raised earlier, because this really wasn't a nexus for manufacturing. There was some manufacturing in Texas, but of course, as you know, it's been sort of traditionally, it was an oil and ag-based economy. And oil and ag are both things that we export, and especially, oil products like gasoline and diesel, other types of petroleum products. So Texas has always been poised to be, an open economy and a global economy. And so that's why I think the state has done well. But of course, there was some manufacturing along the border, which actually went away with NAFTA. So those jobs disappeared. There was quite a bit of job loss in El Paso, for example, in the apparel industry. So thousands and thousands of jobs lost in El Paso. So it's not like, Texans haven't paid their dues. They have. But over time, what we saw is that those losses were, those workers were transitioned into other industries. They were re-educated or retrained, and there was money flowing into El Paso for these workers and into the other border cities. And then, of course, the benefit of the border cities was that they were right on the border with Mexico, and so they were able to turn around, grow in other ways, basically in logistics, transportation services, business services, all the other industries that service these huge trade flows now between the U.S. and Mexico. So those cities were well poised to turn around and benefit from the trade. And that's been the difference. And then if you compare that and their locations, their ability to transform to a small town in the Midwest, for example, that lost their main manufacturing plant, how does, and they're not on a main highway, how does that town transform and transition, and find a substitute industry for, where people can work? That's a much more challenging question.
So final question I ask is a question of everybody from Texas, you being the second person I interviewed from Texas. If you're a visitor to Texas, what are the top 3 things you need to do?
Oh, well, that's a great question. The first thing you do is you go to the rodeo in Fort Worth. That's obvious. Then you go to the Alamo in San Antonio. And then you go to the state capitol in Austin. So, and well, I guess the fourth thing, you go to Houston, but that's fourth on the list.
That's terrible. Well, thank you very, very, very much. I really, really appreciate your time, and thank you.
You're welcome.
You can find out more about PIA at our website, immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. That's all for this edition. Our podcast is produced by the staff of the National Immigration Forum. I'm Ali Noorani. Join us next week for Only in America.